People always ask where it happened. They want a name, usually. Something tangible they can anchor the story to. I could give them one if I wanted to. The river, the bend, the dirt track you take to get there, the sagging gate and the faded no fire sign everyone pretends not to see. I remember all of it clearly enough. But I don't tell them. Because even thinking about that stretch of water feels like something too close to the edge of something that hasn't decided whether it's noticed you yet. Like the dark might lean up out of itself and realise you're staring. So instead, I tell them what matters. It was a river you'd trust. The kind of river people bring kids to in summer. The kind that looks like it's been there forever, doing nothing worse than breeding mozzies and carrying beer cans downstream after a long weekend. Brown water, slow bends, red gums leaning over the banks like tired old men. That's the trick of it, I think. You never expect the river to have teeth. I went out there late arvo with my mate Davey to his mates, because the worst of the heat had finally lifted and the day was loosening its grip on us. Work had been relentless, the sort of weeks where every hour felt owned by someone else. Bills, screens, noise, people talking when you didn't want to listen. Sometimes you just need to stand somewhere quiet with a line in the water and let your thoughts thin out on their own. It wasn't a secret spot, just a bend where the bank dropped off sharp and the current slowed, turning the water dark and reflective. You'd get yellow belly there sometimes, the odd cod if you were lucky, and patient enough to pretend you weren't hoping. Davey brought his folding chair, a decrepit-looking handline, and a battered old esky that rattled softly when he walked. I'd brought my rod, my top-of-the-line tackle box, and the headlamp I kept in the glove box, a habit picked up from too many late nights changing tyres and too many camps where the dark arrived quicker than expected. Davey always gave me grief about that. Every time I pulled something useful out, he'd shake his head and grin. "Mate," he'd say, "if the apocalypse hits, I'm following you. You'll be the guy with duct tape and a snack." I'd tell him he wasn't wrong. He'd laugh, that easy, unguarded laugh of his, and tip his chin towards the water. Davey always liked to call the yellow belly gold bars, like he'd just come up with it. "Gold bar country," he'd say, nodding at the river like we were prospectors instead of two blokes killing time. I think about that a lot now. How normal it all was. How unremarkable, just Davey in his chair and Esky at his feet, talking rubbish the way he always did. We sat on a patch of dirt where the grass had been flattened by years of boots. The bank nearby was undercut, roots exposed where the river had been slowly eating its way inward, but it didn't seem worth mentioning at the time. The air smelled like late summer, wet mud, hot gum leaves, a hint of rot underneath it all. Not unpleasant, just honest, like the place wasn't trying to hide what it was. We cracked 2 tinnies, cast our lines, and settled into the kind of silence you have to earn by being somewhere long enough not to talk over it. The sky shifted gradually from orange to purple to a deep bruised blue. Stars began to appear, faint at first, then sharper, like pinholes punched through fabric. Downriver, a frog called once, stopped, then tried again. Davey let out a long breath, the kind that comes from somewhere deeper than the lungs. "This is living," he said. "Yep," I told him, "until you get eaten alive by mozzies and still catch nothing." He chuckled and leaned back in his chair. A minute or two passed, and then casual as anything he asked, "What time is it, mate?" I pulled my phone from my pocket, checked the screen, and slipped it back without thinking. "Just after 7. Davey nodded, eyes still on the water. "Feels later." "Yeah," I said, "maybe we're aging faster out here." He laughed, but it didn't quite land, because the bush had started to go quiet. Not in a way that set alarms ringing straight away, just thinning out, like someone gently turning a dial. Birds fell silent one by one. The small rustles in the scrub faded, even the air felt like it was holding still. And the mozzies went mad, swarming our ears and necks like they were panicking about something we couldn't see. The first strange thing I noticed was the water. Not a splash, not the quick silver flick of a fish rising, just a ripple long and clean, cutting against the current in a slow V-shape, as if something beneath the surface was being dragged carefully along the riverbed. It moved with a steadiness that didn't belong to anything alive I could name. I leaned forward, squinting into the darkening water. "See that?" I asked. Davy followed my gaze. We watched together, neither of us speaking, the moment stretching out longer than it should have. Then the ripple stopped. It didn't fade or break apart, it simply ceased, the surface smoothing itself until the river looked untouched again, glassy and innocent, as though nothing had disturbed it at all. Davy let out a short, uneasy snort. "Bunyip," he said, the word pitched like a joke he didn't fully believe in. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was noticing the way my skin had tightened, the way something low in my gut had started whispering, "Move." The rod jerked in my hands a moment later, not the familiar tap-tap of a nibble. This was a grab, sudden and forceful enough that the butt of the rod thumped into my thigh and sent a sharp line of pain up my arm. "Whoa!" I grunted, planting my feet. Davy sat forward immediately, all alertness now. "There you go," he said. "That's him. Dogcod." I started winding. Whatever was on the line didn't behave like a fish. There was no frantic run, no surge of resistance followed by slack. It pulled steadily, relentlessly, a constant weight that didn't vary. It felt less like a struggle and more like opposition, as if I'd hooked something that was simply moving where it pleased, like I'd snagged a log. Only the log was swimming. The line hummed under the tension. The rod bowed deeper and deeper until a cold thought pushed its way into my mind. This is going to snap and come back at my face. "This feels weird," I muttered. Davy leaned closer, eyes fixed on the water. "It's big," he said quietly. "Don't lose it." I wound again and again. Then the water shifted. It didn't splash, it didn't break, it shifted, the surface lifting and rolling in a slow, heavy way, like something enormous turning over beneath it. The river bulged, and for half a second I saw it. Not silver like a fish, not dark like an eel. Pale, limestone pale. The colour of bone that's been submerged for too long. It passed beneath the surface like a submerged wall sliding past, smooth and featureless and wrong. My hand stilled without me deciding to stop. The rod gave a single deliberate shake, not a struggle, not a thrash, just one measured tremor, like something acknowledging me. I blinked, breath catching. What the... The bait suddenly came flying back toward me, hook spinning wildly. I jerked my head aside just in time, feeling the rush of air as it missed my cheek. Davy swore. "Snapped ya?" I stared at the line, fingers numb, and checked it. It was perfect. No break, no fray, no damage at all. It was as if something had reached up and unhooked itself, like it had fingers. Davy laughed, but the sound was wrong, too loud, too sharp, forced into the shape of humour. "Righto," he said. "That's not normal." "No," I agreed. And then the river answered us. A deep thump rolled across the water. A dull, heavy impact, like someone dropping a soaked sack into the river from a height. About 5 metres out, the surface began to turn, slowly drawing leaves, foam, and floating debris into a widening circle. It didn't spin fast. It didn't hurry. It pulled inward with patient certainty, like it had all night. Davy stood first. "Stuff this," he said, already folding the chair with a sharp, practiced motion. "I'm not getting eaten by a bloody bunyip." I didn't argue. Whatever had been building in my chest since the ripple felt suddenly urgent, as if my body had made a decision before my head caught up. We packed in silence, hands clumsy, movements rushed. That creeping pressure had settled in, the instinct that tells you to hurry without explaining why. Davy hefted the esky and tucked the chair under his arm. I quickly hooked the line to one of the rings and wedged the rod against my side. We were turning away from the water when I heard it, a scraping sound, coarse and slow, like nails dragged slowly across rock. It came from beneath the bank, not the river, the earth itself. We both looked down at the undercut edge where the river had been gnawing at the dirt for years, hollowing out a dark pocket beneath the grass and exposed roots. For a second nothing happened, and I had just enough time to think I imagined it. Then the mud bulged. The soil lifted, flexed and split, and something pale and bony slid through the opening like a wet finger testing air. Davy made a sound I had never heard from him before, just raw shock pulled straight from the chest. He stumbled back. More of them followed. 3, 4. Limbs, jointed wrong, too long, their surfaces coated in something that looked like wet stone. River silt hardened and fused to them. It didn't drip, it clung, giving them a dull sheen in the failing light. There was no body or head that I could see, just those long, spindly limbs. They moved slowly at first, deliberate, brushing the dirt and grass as though feeling for something familiar. Davy's chair slipped from his hand and hit the ground with a dull thud. At the sound, the limbs stopped. All of them. The pause was absolute. A held breath stretched thin. Then they lunged. Not at me, at Davy. One looped around his ankle and yanked. He went down hard, shoulder slamming into the dirt, esky tumbling from his grip. His fingers clawed at the grass, digging uselessly into soil that gave way beneath him. "Mate!" he screamed. "Mate!" I dropped everything and grabbed his wrists. His skin was slick with sweat, hot and trembling. For a moment it felt possible, like this was just a horrible accident, something strength and panic might still fix. Then the pull came again, stronger, smoother, not violent, almost mechanical. Davy slid through the dirt as if he weighed nothing. His boots carved long grooves in the mud, heels scrambling, toes digging for purchase. His fingernails bent back against the bank, then snapped, one after another, with small, awful sounds I'll never forget. He screamed again, the sound going high and raw, stripped of words. And the bank moved. It didn't crumble, it just folded. The ground beneath the grass flexed inward, like wet paper being pushed from below, tightening around him. Something unseen beneath the surface drew him closer with steady, inexorable force. Davy's eyes found mine. They weren't pleading, they weren't angry, they were shocked, as if he couldn't understand how the world had suddenly decided to break its own rules. I pulled with everything I had. For one heartbeat, just one, I felt him stop. I thought, I've got him. Then the pull changed. It rolled him sideways, stealing leverage, and my grip slid from wrist to fingertips, mud greasing his skin. I lunged, caught his sleeve, and it tore free with a ripping sound that still lives behind my eyes. Davy vanished beneath the bank as if the earth had opened and closed again. The grass snapped back into place. The river stilled. It looked untouched, as though nothing had happened at all. I sat there, gripping empty air, shaking so hard my teeth clicked together. My mouth opened, trying to form his name, trying to call him back into a world that had just decided it didn't need him anymore. But no sound came out. I don't remember making a decision to follow him. What I remember is my body already leaning forward, as if some part of me had moved on without waiting for permission. My heart hammered so hard it felt loose in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. The place where Davy had vanished no longer looked like part of the riverbank at all. The undercut hollow had widened where the mud had collapsed, opening into a dark pocket that seemed to drink in the remaining light. Blackness breathed out of it. It stank of wet earth and rot, of water that had been standing still for too long. I dropped to my knees and clicked my headlamp on. The beam flared white and harsh, cutting into the gap beneath the bank like a blade. "Davy!" I shouted. "Dave!" The sound went nowhere. It didn't echo properly, didn't bounce. It just came back wrong, flattened, lifeless, as though the dark had swallowed it and spat back something thinner. I angled the light deeper. Exposed roots clawed at the air, mud slumped inward. A narrow tunnel sloped down and away beneath the bank, carved smooth by years of slow water and something else besides. And then the beam caught movement. Something pale slid away from the light, just at the edge of it, smooth and curved, the colour of wet limestone. It didn't dart or recoil, it simply withdrew, unhurried, as if the light were an inconvenience rather than a threat. My pulse roared. I leaned closer, stupidly, as though proximity might make sense of it. That was when something closed around my wrist, from the water beside me. A pale limb broke the surface without a sound and wrapped around my forearm like a cold rope. It didn't crush or squeeze. It didn't need to. The certainty of it was worse. The grip felt final, like a decision that had already been made. I screamed and tried to wrench myself back, boots skidding in the mud, fingers scrabbling for purchase. The bank offered nothing. The limb tightened just enough to remind me who was in control. Then it pulled, once, and the ground vanished beneath me. The river swallowed me whole. Cold slammed into my chest, stealing the breath from my lungs in a sharp, panicked gasp that filled my mouth with water. It forced its way into my nose, my ears, my throat. I kicked and thrashed instinctively, but the grip never loosened. I was dragged under the bank, scraped past roots and stone and the black mouth of the tunnel. Light vanished, direction vanished, and then the riverbed dropped away entirely. The water deepened and slowed, thick and heavy around me, as if I'd been pulled into the throat of something vast and waiting. The current here didn't rush or tumble, it moved with deliberate steadiness, guiding rather than carrying. And in that brief, terrifying clarity that comes just before panic overwhelms thought, I understood something that settled into me like ice. This wasn't just an animal. Animals bite, animals thrash, animals kill quickly because they have to. This thing wasn't trying to end me. It was taking me somewhere, the way you take food home from the shops. I woke up choking, not on water, on air, thin, damp air that scraped my throat and tasted of stone and old minerals. I sucked it in too fast, coughed, and felt pain flare along my ribs as if something inside me had cracked. Each breath came shallow and uneven, the space around my chest refusing to give. Something cold pressed hard against my cheek. Rock. I tried to shift my head and couldn't, tried to roll a shoulder, to draw my knees up, to do anything that might loosen the pressure, and nothing moved. My shoulders were pinned, my hips wedged, my legs folded awkwardly behind me, as though I'd been bent to fit a space never meant for a body. I wasn't lying in the earth, I was lodged inside it. The realization hit harder than the pain. Panic surged, hot and immediate, clamping around my chest and throat until for a moment I thought I might black out where I was. Darkness pressed in from every side, not the ordinary dark of night, not the kind your eyes can adjust to, but something denser, stone dark, a blackness so complete it felt textured, as though it had weight, as though it could settle on your tongue if you open your mouth too wide. I forced myself to stop moving. Flailing would only make this worse. I knew that instinctively, the way you know not to thrash in deep water. I stayed as still as I could, trembling, breathing in careful fragments that scraped my ribs with each rise and fall. Somewhere nearby, water dripped, slow and steady. The sound stretched time into something unrecognisable. Minutes elongated into hours, or maybe it was the other way around. Down here, time lost its edges and became liquid, pooling around me without direction. My thoughts skidded uselessly until something small and ordinary surfaced through the fear. My phone. Davey asking the time flashed into my mind, a stupid, casual detail that suddenly felt enormous. I worked one hand down toward my pocket, inch by careful inch, afraid that even that movement might tighten the stone's grip. My fingers closed around it. The relief was so sharp it almost hurt. I drew the phone out, fumbling clumsily, and pressed the side button. Light bloomed in the dark. The torch cast a small, trembling circle around my face, the beam stark and unforgiving against wet stone. It was a blessing for about half a second, and then it showed me where I was, and I wish I'd never turned it on. The light revealed a cave, not a hollow or a burrow, a real cave, its stone walls slick with moisture, catching the beam in dull, uneven glints. The crevice I'd been wedged into opened out into a chamber roughly the size of a bedroom, low-ceilinged and irregular, the rock pressing in close enough to make the space feel intimate in the worst way. The floor was a churn of mud and bone. At first my mind resisted naming what I was seeing, shapes, pale curves, angles half buried in silt. Then the patterns resolved themselves with sickening clarity. Ribs collapsed inwards like broken baskets. Skulls tipped onto their sides, long bones scattered and sunk into the mud like driftwood left behind by a retreating tide. Some of it was animal. That much was easy enough to accept. Some of it was not. In one corner, the remains weren't scattered at all. They'd been gathered and arranged into a low pile, stacked with the care that felt deliberate, not dumped, not forgotten, stored. My phone buzzed softly in my hand, the sudden vibration making me flinch. Low battery. The light trembled as I shifted my grip, sweeping the chamber again, and then it stopped. On a boot. Davy's boot. I recognised it instantly, the scuffed leather, the worn sole, the way the laces were threaded. It stood upright beside a rock, laces tucked neatly inside, as if someone had taken the time to remove it properly. Not ripped away, not torn off in a panic. Placed. The sight of it made my stomach roll. Heat surged up my throat, and for a moment I thought I might vomit. Davy's name rose in me, desperate and useless, pressing against my teeth. I swallowed it. The bones around me seemed to demand silence. The air itself felt thick with it, as though sound had learned better than to exist here. This wasn't a place of struggle. It wasn't a kill site. It was a pantry, and I was food. I worked myself free a fraction at a time, no more than a breath's worth of movement with each attempt. Stone caught and tore at my shirt, scraped skin from my arms and ribs. When my shoulder shifted, it gave a wet internal pop, and a line of pain flared down my arm, bright and immediate. I clamped my teeth together until I tasted blood, afraid that any sound might carry. The cave answered me anyway. At first I thought it was part of the drip, a change in rhythm, a trick of strained hearing. Then the sound separated itself from the silence. A clicking, slow, measured. It reminded me of knuckles tapping stone, but the sound didn't behave like it should. It didn't bounce or fade. It felt close no matter how distant it seemed, as though it belonged to the rock itself. The dripping stopped. The sudden absence of sound was worse than noise. The silence thickened, pressing in until it felt almost viscous. Then came the inhale. Not a breath drawn into lungs, but a steady sucking pull, like water being drawn through a narrow pipe somewhere deep in the stone. It carried with it a sense of depth that made my stomach turn. I swung my phone's beam towards the sound. The light caught the mouth of a low passage, darker than the darkness around it, a narrow throat leading away into something the beam couldn't reach. For a moment it seemed empty, then something slid into view. A limb emerged from the black, long and smooth, its surface the pale colour of sun-bleached driftwood. Stone-slick silt clung to it, dulling any reflection. It came to rest on the cave floor with a gentleness that made my skin crawl, like a hand sat deliberately on a table. Another followed, then another. 5, 6. They moved with unhurried patience, touching stone and mud as they advanced, pausing as if confirming what they already knew, not hunting, not attacking, just checking. The limbs advanced slowly, their progress measured and unhurried. My phone's beam trembled in my hand, the circle of light wobbling against stone and mud as my grip faltered. One limb brushed against the bones scattered on the floor. A skull rolled, bumping softly against another with a dry, hollow sound that seemed far too loud in the stillness. Another traced a line through the mud, following grooves and impressions as though reading a surface that held meaning. Then it reached Davy's boot. The limb touched it lightly, paused, the quiet assurance of recognition, as though it were confirming the presence of something already accounted for. After that, it turned its attention to me. The limb shifted, reorienting with deliberate care, and began to move towards the crevice where I was wedged. As they drew closer, details resolved themselves in the harsh light. Too many fingers branching from each limb, thin and overjointed, bending at angles that made my eyes ache to follow. At their tips, translucent hooks caught the light like polished horn. One finger pressed into the rock beside my face, simply anchoring itself there, holding position, waiting. There was no urgency in it, no hunger, no violence in the movement, only routine. The understanding settled into me slowly and completely. This was not a creature in the act of feeding, it was taking stock. Tears slid unbidden into my hairline, cold against my skin. Behind the limbs, deeper within the passage, the darkness felt occupied, layered, attentive, complete, as though the cave itself was full of something that had no need to step into the light to be known. My phone vibrated in my hand, the sudden pulse of it sharp enough to make me flinch. 5%. The knowledge landed with awful clarity. The light would fail at any moment. I could feel it already, the beam paling, the edges of it softening, as though the darkness were leaning in, waiting its turn. The thing did not rush. It lingered just beyond the reach of the light, motionless, patient, like a dog seated at a gate it knew would eventually open. It did not need to challenge the torch, it only needed to outlast it. In a panic, I flicked the phone as far as my trapped limbs would allow, directly at the creature. It reared back away from the light, a low growl rising from its core. For a moment, I hoped it would flee, scared of the bright object spinning towards it. But with a shriek of anger, one of the hands came down and smashed my phone into the rock. Once, twice, crack. The torch flickered and died. Darkness fell all at once, heavy and absolute, like a lid slammed down over the world. The cave answered immediately. Wet movement surged through the chamber, limbs snapping and scraping against stone. Something retreated, something shifted, and the soundscape collapsed into a chaos of motion that felt far too close. Threaded through it all was a noise that stopped my breath mid-gasp. Clicking, the unmistakable sound of a fishing reel turning, my reel, mimicked with unsettling precision, as though something in the dark had learned it by listening. Terror threatened to lock me in place, but the confusion had bought me seconds. I drove myself upward with everything I had, forcing my chest through the tightest point of the crevice. Stone tore at my sides, but suddenly there was space, just enough. I wriggled free blindly, dragging myself through mud and rock, heedless of the pain. Behind me, the clicking returned, faster now, sharper, no longer patient, no longer waiting. I crawled into the chamber blind. Without the light, the cave became a texture rather than a place. Cold, slick stone under my palms, mud yielding and sucking at my knees, the dull knock of bone against bone as I dragged myself forward. I couldn't tell where my body ended and the floor began. Everything felt the same, wet, unsteady, unforgiving. My thoughts fractured under the effort. Out. Out. I've got to get out. I groped along the wall until my fingers brushed a thin seam where cold air breathed faintly against my skin. The sensation was so slight I might have missed it if I hadn't been desperate for anything that wasn't stone and confinement. I shoved myself into the crack. Rock scraped my shoulders raw, my hips jammed, wedged tight enough to steal my breath. I had to force all the air out of my lungs just to slip forward an inch. The stone pressing against both sides of my head until I could feel my heartbeat pulsing in my skull. Behind me, something entered the chamber. The sound of it was unmistakable, heavy, wet movement, close enough that I could feel a change in the air. The clicking stopped abruptly, as though it had reached the place it intended to be. A touch brushed the sole of my boot. Not a grab, a test. Then the grip closed around my ankle, cold and certain. It tugged once, experimentally, and my body slid backwards a few centimetres, stone tearing at my shoulders as panic flared white-hot. I kicked wildly, boots scraping uselessly against rock, breath rasping out of me in thin, broken sounds. The grip loosened, released, not because it had failed, but because it had decided something. The pressure vanished, the clicking resumed, receding slowly into the chamber, unhurried. And in that sudden space, a worse understanding settled over me. It didn't need to pull me back. It didn't need to force me anywhere at all. It could simply wait, block the exit, let the dark do the rest. Down here, time wasn't a threat. It was a tool. I crawled on anyway. What else could I do? Blind, inch by inch, feeling my way forward with hands that had begun to shake from strain and cold. The crack twisted and dipped and rose, sometimes widening just enough for a breath of moving air to brush my face, a whisper of space that felt like hope. Before tightening again and forcing me flat, belly pressed to stone, wriggling forward like something reduced to instinct. Time thinned. Thought followed it. My mind grew sleek, unreliable. Sounds bled into one another. The steady drip of water began to stretch and warp until I could hear Davy scream threaded through it. Not words, not even a voice, just that high, raw sound, pulled long and thin, as though it had soaked into the rock itself and was being squeezed back out, drop by drop. Once the passage narrowed so abruptly, I had to turn my face sideways and push my cheek along the stone. My shoulder scraped hard enough to steal my breath. My ribs screamed in protest, each movement grinding bone against rock until I was sure something would give. And then the air changed, space opened. I slid forward into it, lungs burning, hands shaking, and the sudden openness hit me like a blow. A chamber, real space. Relief surged so fast my eyes burned with it. For a heartbeat, I tasted freedom so vividly it felt solid. I crawled towards it, desperate now, palms slick with mud. And my fingers closed around something that should not have been there. Cold leather. A lace. I froze. My hand moved again, slower this time, unwilling to confirm what it already knew. A familiar scuff beneath my fingertips, the shape of a boot. My heart stumbled. I kept crawling, despite myself, breath shallow, mind rebelling, until my knee struck something round and unyielding, smooth, hard. A skull. The denial collapsed then, all at once. I reached forward again, shaking, and my fingers brushed the boot fully into the open. Davy's boot. Same place, same rock, same mud-stacked corner. The pantry. I hadn't turned around. I hadn't doubled back. I had crawled forward in what I felt like a straight, relentless line. Hadn't I? And yet the cave had returned me, like a belt on a machine that carried you away only to deliver you back to where you started, like the place itself had decided I wasn't finished yet. The understanding hit me so hard my stomach lurched. This wasn't just fear, it was hopelessness, because a creature can be outrun, outsmarted, fought, but how do you outrun a place? That was when I heard it, not behind me, everywhere. The clicking returned, layered and echoing, but not echoing, sounding at once like fishing reels turning, knuckles tapping stone, the slow, settling noises of rock itself. It felt as if the cave were responding, acknowledging something well done. From somewhere impossibly deep, deeper than the passage could possibly go, came a wet inhale, vast and intimate at the same time, as though the chamber itself were drawing breath. The darkness leaned forward, and for the first time, with a clarity that cut through everything else, I understood the truth of it. It wasn't chasing me. It was waiting for the moment I stopped crawling, because eventually in the dark, everyone does. I didn't think anymore. Thinking required distance, and there was none left. I moved because stopping felt worse than anything that might happen if I didn't. I scrambled through the chamber on hands and knees, palms skidding over slick stone and mud, searching blindly for any flaw in the rock, any crack, any place that air still moved. My hand slid across something smooth and round before my mind caught up with what it was. Another skull. My knee struck bone and sent it clattering softly away. I didn't stop to listen. Listening felt dangerous. The wall gave me nothing until my fingers brushed a narrow slit, tighter than the last, so small I almost missed it. From it came the faintest exhale of cold air, barely more than a suggestion. I shoved my arm into it. Yes. The space resisted me immediately, stone grinding shoulder and ribs as I forced myself forward. Skin peeled away, pain flared and blurred the edges of the world until sensation became a single, overwhelming thing. Behind me, the clicking followed, keeping pace with a certainty that made my stomach turn, as though it knew exactly how much time it had, as though it knew I would tire long before it did. The passage dipped without warning, and I slid into water up to my waist. The cold slammed into me hard enough to steal the breath from my lungs, a sharp, involuntary gasp that filled my mouth with icy water. I waded forward blindly, hands skimming slime-slick rock, feet finding nothing solid beneath them. The roof dropped, forced me down, first into a crouch, then onto my knees, and finally flat to my belly, dragging myself through freezing water that soaked my clothes and numbed my limbs. My chin struck the surface, and I swallowed it, gagging, the taste of stone and silt flooding my mouth. Images crowded my mind, unbidden, the passage filling behind me, water rising, the rock pressing in again, being pinned, being arranged, being left, stored. I whispered nonsense under my breath, fragments of words with no meaning, just sound to hold myself together, to keep my thoughts from splintering completely. Then, the air changed. It rushed in sharp and clean, cutting through the stink of stone and rot, cold night air, eucalyptus, the unmistakable smell of the bush after dark. Hope hit me like a blow. I surged forward, suddenly clumsy with desperation. Roots tore at my hands, mud collapsed beneath my weight. I clawed upward, lungs burning, vision swimming. and burst out of the riverbank like something dug up too early, gasping and shaking under the open sky, the night air pouring into my chest like a second chance I hadn't earned. I lay on the grass for the briefest moment, gasping, my body shuddering so hard my teeth clicked together. The night sky hung open above me, stars sharp and indifferent. I took inventory without meaning to. No phone, no headlamp, no Davy. Just mud ground into my clothes, blood drying on my skin, and the cold air tearing in and out of my lungs as though my body didn't trust itself to stop. I didn't look back. The idea of turning around felt impossible, like stepping too close to the edge again. I pushed myself up and ran through the scrub, branches tearing at my legs. I stumbled, went down hard, clawed myself back to my feet and kept going, lungs burning, vision tunnelling, driven by something too simple to call thought. Run. Don't stop. I ran until the bush thinned and the dirt road appeared beneath my feet like a promise. Then my legs gave out entirely. I collapsed in the middle of it and folded in on myself, sobbing into my hands with the thin, broken sounds of a child who doesn't yet know how to be quiet about fear. A couple in a ute found me not long before midnight. They slowed, then stopped, hazard lights flashing, faces pale when they saw me. They thought I'd been hit by a car. I didn't correct them. I don't remember trying to explain anything at all. The ambos arrived quickly. Hands, questions, the sharp glare of lights, a blanket around my shoulders, someone telling me to breathe slowly, to stay with them. I nodded and shook and did what I was told. In the back of the ambulance I flinched when water ran, when metal clicked, when anything made that small, precise sound. My brain had already begun to rearrange itself, quietly and without asking permission. Clicking now meant danger. The SES went out the next morning. They dragged the river, dug into the bank where the ground had collapsed. They found bones, old ones, animal mostly. They found a tunnel carved into the earth, smooth-walled and wrong. But they didn't find Davy. Nothing recent enough to give his family certainty. Nothing clean enough to point at and say, this is what happened. The official line was simple: undercut bank, sudden collapse, swept away by the current. That's what went on paper. That's what people can live with. Davy's missus tried to visit me in hospital. I could hear her in the hall, speaking frantically to the staff, but I refused to see her. I didn't know what shape the truth was meant to take, or how to put it into words that wouldn't sound insane or cruel. I held him, and the earth ate him. Didn't feel like something you would say to anyone and still expect them to breathe afterward. Later, in the hospital bathroom, I stood at the sink and washed my hands. I scrubbed them hard, palms and knuckles and the thin skin around my nails, watching the water cloud and then run clear again. I scrubbed until my fingers burned and the skin went pink and tight. That was when I noticed it. Beneath my fingernails, packed deep where the brush couldn't quite reach, was river mud, dark and sticky, the same colour as the bank where Davy had disappeared. And threaded through it, almost delicate in its thinness, was a faint streak of red. Blood. Davy's blood. I scraped at it with my nails, scrubbed harder, turned the water hotter. It didn't matter. The mud stayed lodged there, stubborn and intimate, like something that had worked its way in on purpose, like a reminder, like proof. I went back to my bed and sat there with my hands in my lap until morning, staring at them as the night slowly loosened its grip on the windows. I couldn't stop thinking about the moment my grip failed, the way the fabric tore, the sudden emptiness where his arm had been. I saw his eyes every time I closed mine, not bleeding, not accusing, just confused, as if he couldn't understand why I wasn't strong enough to hold him in a world that suddenly refused to make sense. After that, I stopped going anywhere near the river. At first it was deliberate, choosing longer routes, avoiding the banks, and then it became instinctive. Even the sound of water moving made my stomach tighten, a dull, reflexive clench that came from somewhere deeper than thought. I stopped fishing entirely. The rods stayed in the shed, untouched, until one day I just gave them away. When people asked, I told them I'd just gone off it. No one questioned that. People understand when someone quietly steps away from the thing they love. 6 months passed. By then, the story had begun to lose its sharp edges for everyone but me. Davy's name came up less often. The river returned to being just a river in other people's mouths. Then one evening my phone buzzed with a message from a number I didn't recognise. No name, no greeting. Seen the SES report. You're lucky it had already fed. Another message followed almost immediately. Don't ever go back. Don't go looking. I called the number. The line went dead without ringing. I tried to text back. The message never delivered. I sat there with the phone in my hand for a long time. It didn't read like a prank. There was no flourish to it, no attempt to scare for its own sake. It read like a warning, the kind given by someone who had already learned the cost of ignoring one. Someone who had seen it, or someone who had lost somebody to it. For a long time, I thought the worst part was the grabbing, or the dark, or waking up wedged in that crevice with my chest pinned so tight I could only breathe in small, broken pieces, each one bargained for. But it isn't. The worst part is what it did to home. Because home is where you're meant to stop bracing yourself. It's where the dark isn't supposed to matter, where you can turn your back on a room without feeling watched, where your body is allowed to unclench. Last week, after work, I came in, kicked my boots off by the door, like I always do, and went straight into the shower. Hot water filled the room, steam fogging the mirror, the sound of it loud and enclosing. It was the first real comfort I'd felt in years, heat sinking into muscle, water pounding down my shoulders hard enough to quiet my thoughts. I stood there longer than I should have, letting it run, trying to convince myself of something simple. It's just water, just pipes, just a house doing what houses do, not a doorway. When I stepped back into the hallway, still damp, bare feet slapping softly against the floorboards, I knew something was wrong before I understood why. My boots weren't where I'd left them. They were at the front door instead, placed neatly on the mat, side by side, toes perfectly even, laces tucked in, the way you do it if you were being considerate, prepared, polite. I stood there staring at them, my throat tightening, because I live alone. No mates with spare keys, no kids, no pets, no draft strong enough to move heavy work boots across a house and line them up like that. And then I saw it. On the toe of my right boot was a smear of dark mud, wet and fresh, river mud, still holding its shape, and pressed into it, faint but unmistakable, was a pattern that made my stomach drop. Thin, segmented lines, too many joints. A mark like a fingerprint, if fingerprints weren't meant to belong to hands. A small, careful touch, as though something had checked on me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the living room with every light on until morning crept in through the windows, washing the house in a pale, ordinary glow that felt undeserved. And the whole time, one thought kept circling, slow and inescapable. The river didn't follow me home. The river was just where it liked to collect. So if you're ever out fishing one evening and the bush goes quiet, not suddenly, but like the world is gently being turned down, pay attention. If the water bulges as though something has rolled beneath it, if the current begins to pull in on itself, slow and patient, don't cast again. Don't pack up after this one. Don't stop to finish your beer. Just leave. Because some things in this country don't bite. They don't chase. They don't thrash and splash and make a show of themselves. They just reach up and take you. And if you're unlucky, it doesn't end there. You don't die. You get stored somewhere dark for later.